This is Catholicism's argument. The emphasis here is on Peter. And this gives rise to a line of elite authoritative leaders through the process of apostolic succession.
All right, let me clarify this right out of the gate, because this is where these arguments always miss the point. Catholics do not believe Peter was some random guy elevated by church politics centuries later. We believe Jesus Christ gave Peter real, visible authority among the apostles, and that authority did not disappear when Peter died. That authority itself goes back to Christ. That function, that permanent office, continued through succession. The title Pope developed over time, but the authority in the office is biblical reality. This is not some Roman invention, it's a biblical reality. So let's go look at the actual text. In Matthew 16:18-19, Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Keys, not suggestions, not a symbolic metaphor. In the Old Testament, keys always represented real authority. In Isaiah 22:22, it talks about the key of the house of David being given to Eliakim, the prime minister of the kingdom. When the king, Jesus, ascends to heaven, someone must wield his delegated authority on earth. He gives those keys to Peter. This is the Davidic kingdom in biblical language. No other apostle is given the keys individually like this. The binding and loosing power is later shared with the others in Matthew 18, but the keys are Peter's alone, and that matters.
The disciples didn't go away saying, wow, Jesus just made him the Pope. Because in chapter 18, verse 1, there's grumbling. And the disciples came to Jesus saying, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, why do you come to Jesus asking him, who's the greatest, if in chapter 16, it's already been established?
That argument sounds clever, but it actually falls apart really fast. The disciples not fully understanding something does not cancel out what Jesus did. If that were the case, we'd have to throw out half the gospel. They didn't understand the Eucharist in John 6. They didn't understand the passion predictions, and they argued about who was the greatest of all time. Human weakness does not erase divine institution. In Matthew 18, the apostles asking who is the greatest doesn't mean they rejected Peter's role. It means that they were still struggling with pride, competition, and misunderstanding. Jesus uses it as a teaching moment about humility, not as a revocation of Peter's authority. And let's not forget what happens after that. At the Last Supper, Jesus doesn't say, Peter, you're just another guy. He says in Luke 22:32, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brethren. Jesus singles Peter out as the one responsible for strengthening the others. That is leadership language. After the resurrection in John 21, Jesus doesn't restore the apostles collectively. He restores Peter personally 3 times, saying, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. The flock belongs to Christ. The earthly shepherd is Peter.
I would argue that Peter didn't even see it this way. In the book that bears his name, 1 Peter chapter 5, the first 3 verses there make it clear that Peter does not see himself as the Pope. He writes, so I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. So the disciples don't see Peter as having been made a Pope. Jesus makes it clear that Peter hadn't been made a Pope. And Peter later makes it clear that he doesn't see himself as having been established.
This is a favorite verse for anti-Catholic arguments, and it's a weak one. Yes, Peter calls himself a fellow elder, and that's humility, not a denial of authority. A leader who leads like Christ is not a dictator, he is a servant. That's the entire Christian model of leadership, the servant of servants. Paul does the exact same thing in Philemon 8 and 9. He says that he could command, but instead he appeals as a brother. Does that make Paul less of an apostle? No. And in the very same letter, Peter refers to shepherding the flock of God. Who gave him that job? Jesus himself in John 21. Peter is not denying his role. He is describing the way he leads, not denying that he leads. And here's the point the preacher doesn't want to deal with. In Acts 1, who stands up and takes charge? Peter. In Acts 2, who preaches at Pentecost? Peter. In Acts 3, who works the public miracle at the temple gate? Peter. In Acts 10, who receives the vision that opens the church to the Gentiles? Peter. In Acts 15, at the Council of Jerusalem, the first great doctrinal crisis, who speaks and ends the argument? Peter. James gives a summary, sure, but Peter gives the final authoritative declaration. That is primacy in action, not in title. That is the office of the rock. St. Clement of Rome, writing around AD 96, while the Apostle John is still alive, he writes to the church in Corinth and intervenes. Why? Because he has authority beyond his local church. And that only makes sense if Rome, Peter's seat, is already seen as having primacy. St. Ignatius of Antioch around AD 107 refers to the Church of Rome as presiding in love over the other churches. And that is before Constantine, before medieval power, before any politics. St. Irenaeus in Against Heresies around AD 180 gives a list of succession of bishops in Rome from Peter and Paul down to this day and says that every church must agree with Rome because of its preeminent authority. That is 2nd century Christianity, no medieval corruption there. Even secular historians admit that Rome held a unique position of authority very early on. And you can hate the theology, but the history is not on the preacher's side. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says in paragraphs 881 and 882, it states that the Pope is the successor of Peter, the visible source and foundation of unity, and that the bishops share in the apostolic mission in union with them. That is straight out of scripture and history. And here's the point that matters spiritually. Jesus did not leave behind a Bible only. In fact, he didn't leave around anything except the church. He left behind the church, a visible church with leadership, structure, sacraments, and an authority to teach in his name. If every Christian is the final authority, then Jesus failed at establishing unity. And yet in John 17, he prays that we would be one just as he and the Father are one, not invisible unity, visible unity. And that requires leadership, that requires succession, and that requires a shepherd to hold the line. And that shepherd started with Peter. So no, Peter didn't walk around calling himself the Pope. That title developed later as the church grew and the language developed, but the office, the function, the authority, and the mission were given directly by Christ. You can reject the papacy, but don't pretend it came out of nowhere. Don't pretend Peter was just another guy, and don't ignore 2,000 years of history because one misunderstood verse in 1 Peter 5. The real question is not, did Peter call himself Pope? The real question is, did Jesus give Peter real authority over his church? And did that authority continue? Scripture, history, and the early Christians say, yes, Jesus prayed for unity. He gave us a visible structure to achieve it. He's calling you today, not to chaos, but to the truth, unity, and visible authority of his one living church. And that church still stands. Thank you for watching, and God bless.